And we're back. The CLINK, episode 4. So, we're going to backtrack just a wee bit. You might recall these two items from the previous episode. You have the chastity belt and the boot. A couple of really gruesome instruments of torture. But let us continue. Now this panel here has a lot of different images, all related by a technique that I said at the onset of this documentary: stress and duress. Putting prisoners in uncomfortable postures for prolonged periods of time. Something that is oftentimes done in prisons and detention centers today. Now, I'm foreshadowing just a little bit, but let us move ahead. See if we can add a little bit more context. This is known as the scavenger's daughter. Although the rack was said to be the ultimate instrument of torture, these irons, invented by Sir William Skeffington, Lieutenant of the Tower of London, compressed the victim, causing great pain as well as bleeding from the nose and ears. They have the advantage of being supremely portable. Now, I'm not sure I would have put those two words together, supremely portable, but the English have their way with the language. Did you know that Guy Fawkes was put in these irons before being put in the rack in the Tower of London? Guy Fawkes. When you see images of protests in today's world, you might see men and women wearing these large masks who identify themselves with a group or a movement known as Anonymous, the hackers, or we say the hacktivists. And the masks that they wear are the Guy Fawkes mask. Guy Fawkes plotted to detonate a bomb that would destroy Parliament in London. Authorities were on the case, and they intercepted the plans and arrested Guy Fawkes. Today they have Guy Fawkes Day in London and England, celebrating Guy Fawkes with a bonfire. And then there's lots of drinking and dancing and everything else, so it's not a total waste of time. But let's go back of what maybe we can magnify. That's what the prisoner might look like. Let's go back. Stress and duress. Now this kind of makes it look like these prisoners are simply bored and idle and so on and so forth, but I can assure you these are painful forms of stress and duress. And at the CLINK, they have some of these on display, so you can actually pick them up, inspect their stability. There's one right there. Imagine the head being forced into this direction or vice versa, and the feet Now this might look a little small, but realize that centuries ago the adults were much smaller than they are today. Kind of skipped over this, but let's not neglect the importance of the rack. And the rack is significant for a few reasons. One of which is, it not only was an instrument of torture, it was also part of a larger constellation of surveillance, inspection, apprehending certain targeted individuals who might be threatening the monarchy. And the rack was used for purposes of interrogation, to interrogate the suspect. Because oftentimes treason was carried out not by an individual, but rather by small groups who were plotting to overthrow the monarchy. And here you see representatives of the monarchy not only observing, but also asking questions about who your accomplices are. Now let me give you an example. During the Nazi regime, there were many attempts to assassinate Hitler. And one in particular, and I'm going to use the English translation of his name, George Elser. And George was, he was a common man, but had lots of skills. And he put together a bomb that was detonated in Munich, targeting Hitler. Hitler changed his plans. He left the podium after his speech 13 minutes prior to the timed device. Hitler got out unscathed. Many people were killed. Many others were severely injured. But when George was taken into custody, he had on him plans that linked him to the bomb. He was interrogated, he was tortured, he was beaten. They wanted to know who his accomplices were. He was working alone. He was a bit of a smart-ass, according to some documentarians. And they said, "Who's your accomplice?" He would say, "Winston Churchill." Now, they could have very easily killed him without any pursuit of interrogation, but they really wanted to know who this guy was and what he was up to. Eventually, the SS came up with the idea to give him all of the pieces of the bomb, laid them out on a table, unassembled, and said, "Put together the bomb." And he did. It was that moment they realized that this guy was capable of putting together this very high-tech bomb. He was then imprisoned. They moved him to Berlin, Sachsenhausen prison. And inspection, interrogation during the times of the English monarchy, which is pictured here, is an example of how the rack was used. Now bear in mind the pressure points. You have these two torturers, highly skilled, and they're putting pressure in the knees and the elbows, as well as the hips, but since the knees and the elbows are further out in the range of pressure, those are the joints that are subject to the most vulnerable pressure. And the idea is to keep the victim in the rack pulled to the extent where the knees and the elbows do not dislocate, they do not pop. And it's during that moment of pressure that the intense interrogation continues, asking who the accomplices are, etc., etc. Now, you might recall foreshadowing. At the beginning of the tour of the CLINK, you might recall the poverty-stricken woman at the begging grate, accompanied by a rat. The CLINK was infested with rats. Vermin. They carry diseases. So on and so forth. When I was living in London more recently, there was one of my favorite restaurants where I was seated talking to the waitress. And apparently down the street, the real estate moguls were furthering their gentrification. And they destroyed an apartment building. It's a demolition crew. And the restaurants in the neighborhood were immediately alarmed because that particular abandoned building had been rat infested. And the rats then migrated into the restaurant zone. And the waitress informed me, and I take her word for it. She said, "Michael, did you know that London is the most rat-infested city in all of Europe?" I took her word for it. And during lockdown, during the COVID-19 pandemic that we are experiencing, if you followed the New York Times, there was a report in Chinatown and Little Italy that as these restaurants were allowed to open with dining on the streets, waiters, waitresses, and customers were alarmed to the extent of rat infestation. Now, during the pandemic, restaurants were closed, so according to the New York Times, these rats had little to eat. In fact, one report in the New York Times said that these rats were eating each other. And they were attacking diners in otherwise fine restaurants in New York. I mention that because the CLINK was rat infested. Not only were the prisoners manacled, tied up, shackled, but they were subject to the whims of rats. Now, the CLINK is located on the bank of the Thames River. And frequently, the Thames River, during this period of history, would overflow because the banks were not secured. Given the proximity of the CLINK to the Thames, this prison would fill halfway up with river water. And those who were manacled were extremely vulnerable, not only to drowning, but to being infected with other diseases. What we have here is the iconic symbol of rat infestation, the Rat Man. Now we're going to take another pause. I'm going to go back to my kitchen for another cup of coffee. And when we return, we're going to go into episode 5 of the CLINK. We'll talk about rat infestation and these horrific conditions of confinement.